Well, for the longest time, I've been working in artificial intelligence and machine learning. It's been really just a pure research discipline. Nerds geeking out, trying to invent the next equation, next computer program that can do better than the previous one. But none of them worked all that well. So if I went out in the real world and I asked somebody if they heard about AI, usually it's not something they paid much attention to. But that all changed. This changed around 2012, and I'll tell you more about why that's such a special year. And from there, it's taken off really, really quickly. 2015 is when AI started hitting the mainstream news. For example, you might have seen a headline like this: Stephen Hawking warns artificial intelligence could end mankind. Or maybe soon thereafter you saw this headline: Elon Musk saying AI is the biggest risk we face as a civilization. Then, just a little bit later, Elon Musk invests $1 billion in a new AI company. In fact, that's OpenAI, a company I was part of for about 2 years, and where we were building AI with the intent for it to be good for everybody, with the benefits distributed as equally as possible. So the idea here was, even though it could be a dangerous thing, maybe if we build it right, it can be really good for everyone. And then you might have seen headlines saying, hey, everything you hear about AI and robotics from Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, actually it's not true. So completely opposite opinions here. Another thing that started happening around the time is governments started getting involved. So for example, the one maybe that struck me the most is on September 1st, 2017, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, gave a lecture. And in Russia, he can give a lecture to everybody in school. So everybody's in school in Russia, first day of school, September 1, 2017. He gives a lecture. And what does he tell the kids? He tells them, whoever leads the way in artificial intelligence will rule the world. So very clearly emphasizing the importance of being at the frontier of artificial intelligence. But it's not just Vladimir Putin in Russia. In fact, at this point, since 2017, there is a minister dedicated to AI, and the country that has such a minister is United Arab Emirates, the first country to have one. Then in Europe, President Macron of France declared he wants to ensure that Europe does not depend on countries in other parts of the world to establish AI capabilities and reap the benefits of AI. In the US, where I'm based, well, mentions of AI and machine learning are tabulated here. You see, until 2015, pretty much no mention of AI or machine learning. And then all of a sudden, it shot up. In fact, many countries have made AI plans. This started with Canada being the first one, and Canada, as we'll see, is where some of the very early discoveries were made. And from there, many countries followed suit, making their own plans. And these plans can vary wildly. For some of the bigger countries, like USA, China, the plans tend to encompass pretty much everything. But then for smaller countries, often they're more specialized. They might focus on how AI might help their healthcare system, or how it might help their transportation, or maybe how it could help their military defense, and so forth. Now, it's not just governments. Companies have been big in AI space too. One of the very big early signs here was DeepMind. This was a startup out of London. DeepMind was acquired by Google for $500 million. This is now several years ago. It was a very large amount at that time. And the interesting thing here is that at the time, DeepMind did not have any revenue, did not have any clear plans for revenue. They didn't have very clear plans for what kind of product they might build that they might yield a plan for revenue. What did they have? DeepMind had some of the world's best AI researchers. And these researchers have just showcased an amazing breakthrough in learning to play video games automatically. That was what we knew about DeepMind. And for Google, AI was so important that they acquired the entire company. Then some of my former postdocs graduated from Berkeley several years back, then started a company on self-driving. And that company on self-driving called Auto, at the time, within 6 months of founding the company, was acquired by Uber for a very large amount. One of the things that's been happening, I imagine you've noticed yourself also, is China is starting to play a very big role in AI. For example, the biggest pure AI startup, I would argue, is in China. It's called SenseTime. And a few years into the company, they were valued at $3 billion. And now a couple of years later, they're valued at around $7-8 billion, maybe more by now. So this is a company that builds computer vision technology. They build the capability of, well, what's heavily used in China, to recognize anyone, anywhere. If you have a picture or a camera that's watching the street, the system can recognize who is there, report out to police departments, government, and so forth. Of course, a lot of ethical considerations here too, and we'll get to that at a future time. But for now, I want to think about, okay, here's this amazing technology, frontier technology, very high valuation. Same thing happened in Japan. Preferred Networks, one of the, I would say, the leading AI company in Japan, a couple years into its existence, was valued at $2 billion. This is a company I'm actually an advisor to, and I spend quite a bit of time every year in October. I go to Japan, spend a couple days in Tokyo at Preferred Networks, and they're building the frontier of AI for robotics and also for several other domains. And what they've been capable of doing is partnering with some of the other more traditional big companies in Japan and bringing them AI technologies. Now, these were just a couple of examples of startups, but if you look at the fuller picture, there are many, many startups out there that are raising a lot of money, that are really taking off and achieving high valuations. So what you see here in this graph is total startups with the gray curve, and then in blue, AI startups. And what we see is that the fraction of AI startups back in 2000 was almost none of the startups were AI startups. But by 2015, it's about half, and it's becoming even more and more since then. If we look at investments, we see a similar pattern. Around 2000, even 2010, almost no investments in AI startups. But then from there, it really started taking off, and it's still accelerating, it seems, today. Now, another thing you could look at is big existing companies. Do they care about AI? And here's a graph showing that IT companies in their earning calls, just around 2014, 2015, you see that big takeoff in mentioning AI. Before that, it was big data, cloud, but that's now supplanted by mentions of AI. How about other industries, not IT? The takeoff is just a little bit later, but we see the same thing happening here. Around 2015, earning calls start mentioning AI very, very frequently. If you look at the total pie of funding that's happening in AI, we see here that, well, a lot of it is happening in China, a lot of it in the USA, but also the rest of the world has a substantial chunk when taken all together. The other thing we see is growth. Large growth in investments in this space. Now, how about for somebody like me, professor in AI? Well, it turns out before 2015, that is before AI became mainstream, popular, and at the core of what many companies are doing, well, my life was a lot simpler in many ways. I spent a lot of my days just sitting behind a computer, maybe answering some emails, maybe sitting in some meetings with students, writing some papers together, and so forth. But then starting 2015, all of a sudden, everybody wants to know about AI. And so, for example, really fun thing here is dinner with Jeff Bezos, who I think you know as the founder and CEO of Amazon. So Jeff organizes this getaway once a year called Mars, and he invites about 100 people he wants to learn from. And so here, that's me sitting at the dinner table with Jeff, where he's going around the table and trying to learn from everyone there, what is it that's new in AI, how to think about it, and so forth. So a completely different world. Then that's me there also. You can't really recognize me probably, but I'm standing all the way in the front on the stage there in front of about 8,000 people, giving a presentation about the latest research we did in my lab at Berkeley at the time. And so what you see here is a super popular conference with thousands of people attending. 8,000 that year. This was 2017, I believe. This is up from just 1,000 or 2,000 people attending it just a few years before that. So a big increase in interest. And these 8,000 people, this is actually a very, very mathematical conference. This is for people who are digging into AI very deeply, writing code, driving new equations to try to get to the next level. These are not, this is not a conference for, let's say, executive leadership. This is really for AI researchers. Now, the next year, this same conference sold out in less than 12 minutes. Now, that's totally crazy, right? This is like pop concerts. Tickets go available online. A few minutes later, it's sold out. You've been refreshing. You didn't make it, you don't get to go. So we found solutions to that, of course, since we have ensured that people can attend virtually as much as possible and so forth. But this is just to show the immense popularity of AI compared to where we were just a few years before that. Maybe the kind of craziest story, and I think this one's really, really crazy in many ways, is that here's a painting. And this painting is made by an AI system. And it was sold at Christie's for about $500,000. Now, this painting, what's so unique about it is that it's the first, now I wouldn't say the first painting generated by an AI system, but the first painting generated and then marketed as an AI painting. And as a consequence, thanks to this good marketing around it, this first AI painting, people bid quite high to get this. Another interesting thing here is that when you look closely, the signature of the painting, that signature is an equation. It's not a name of a person, it's an equation, and I zoomed in on it below the screenshot of the painting. And that equation is something I'll tell you more about later, but that equation was invented by a student who was a PhD student in Montreal, who was catching up with his friends in a bar. They're all AI researchers, they start talking about AI. He invents this equation. Then later, he writes a paper about it. Somebody else releases open source code that also implements what's in that paper, and they get a third party downloads that code and uses it to generate this painting. So what you see here is also that the ability to adopt AI systems has really, really accelerated, because one person invented the equation, another person released the code, and yet a third person was using it to generate art in this case. So is there some hype in this space? I think it's fair to say absolutely yes. There's a lot of hype in this space. I mean, why would you pay this much money for this painting? In fact, you could ask somebody else to download the same code and also generate a painting for you automatically. So clearly there was something hypey about all of this. But what's so exciting about AI is that there's actually a lot of progress being made under the hood. And so this hype, while sometimes maybe it goes a little bit too far, this hype is building on real progress underneath. And that is what's so exciting really right now about AI, that we've gone from systems that don't really work. We're trying to make progress, make a little progress, but it still doesn't work well enough to go into the real world, to systems that we can put in the real world. And of course, that's when it starts creating value. People start interacting with it in many places, and everybody starts picking up on it.